In 1954, in a remote valley in northwest Vietnam, a battle took place that would change the world. It wasn't just the end of one war, it was the beginning of another, far more brutal one. And that is the story of Dien Bien Phu. It was often compared to Nha San, but 10 times larger, or perhaps akin to Verdun. For context, Nha San was an earlier French defensive victory, while Verdun is a symbol of the carnage and bloody war of attrition of World War I. Right from the start, the French soldiers there seemed to have a premonition of the dreadful scale and the grim fate awaiting them. Our backdrop is 1953. France's war in Indochina had already dragged on for 8 years and was at a complete stalemate. Both the French forces and the Viet Minh were exhausted, and they desperately needed a decisive victory to break the deadlock. It was a classic stalemate. The French, with artillery and air support, could turn any position into a nearly impregnable fortress. But the Viet Minh were like water, always finding ways around, avoiding pitched battles, and refusing an all-out engagement. Each side was strong in its element, but neither could destroy the other. To break this deadlock, General Henri Navarre launched an incredibly daring gamble. His plan was to establish an airborne breadshed, essentially a massive fortress supplied entirely by air at Dien Bien Phu. The goal? To lure the Viet Minh into a conventional battle where the superior French firepower would crush them, thus giving the French an absolute advantage at the negotiating table. A deadly investment. A gamble this big, of course, required a massive investment, and $400 million was the sum the United States poured in. Following the Korean War, the fear of the so-called domino effect of communism caused Washington to do a complete 180. From opposing colonialism, the U.S. now became the primary financier of the French war effort. The war in Vietnam was no longer solely a French affair. With the financial backing of the U.S., the French began constructing their fortress. Dien Bien Phu quickly rose as an engineering marvel in the jungle depths. Yet ironically, the foundation of this fortress was built upon fatal miscalculations. Looking at the numbers reveals the French confidence. Over 10,000 elite troops, 10 M24 tanks disassembled, airlifted, and reassembled on site, 9 fighter planes operating from 2 airfields, 60 artillery pieces ready to unleash a firestorm. This was a modern war machine, engineered for destruction. However, all that formidable power was placed in the worst possible location, an isolated valley nearly 300 kilometers from Hanoi. Worse still, it was surrounded by dense, rugged hills. Militarily, anyone who controlled those hills controlled the entire valley. Essentially, the French had built themselves a perfect trap. The fatal arrogance. Not one Viet Minh gun can fire 3 rounds before being destroyed. This statement by Colonel Charles P. Roth, the artillery commander, became the symbol of French arrogance. They simply couldn't imagine their enemy capable of dragging heavy artillery hundreds of miles through dense jungle and mountain terrain. That was their fatal mistake. While the French were busy building their trap, on the other side, General Vo Nguyen Giap was preparing a response. It wasn't just a military plan, it was a colossal feat of logistics and human will that surpassed all of the French intelligence's predictions at the time. The first number? 50,000. That was the number of regular troops General Giap secretly mobilized to encircle Dien Bien Phu, a force nearly 5 times larger than the French garrison. While the French thought they were setting a trap, they were, in fact, the ones being encircled. The question was, how do you feed and supply a 50,000-man army deep in the jungle? The answer? Wasn't planes or trucks, but 500 kilometers of new trails cut through the forest, tens of thousands of reinforced bicycle carts carrying hundreds of kilograms each, and hundreds of thousands of civilian porters working day and night. This was a total people's war, an extraordinary logistical effort that French reconnaissance planes completely failed to detect. And here is what must have been Colonel Piroth's greatest horror. Not a few scattered guns, but 240 artillery pieces and mortars, including heavy 105mm howitzers, had been manhandled up the mountainsides. They were placed in meticulously camouflaged bunkers, completely dominating the valley below and virtually immune to French counter-battery fire. Every element of Navarre's gamble had collapsed even before the battle began. Then, at 5 p.m. on March 13, 1954, the storm broke. Hundreds of General Giap's guns, hidden on the slopes, simultaneously opened fire. For the French soldiers in the valley, it was literal hell on earth. Their fortress instantly turned into a grave. The speed of the collapse was astonishing. In less than 48 hours, the two supposedly strongest strong points, Beatrice and Gabriel, were wiped out. The accuracy of the Viet Minh artillery was terrifying. The shock was so profound that Colonel Charles Piroth, who had boasted he would neutralize the enemy artillery, committed suicide with a grenade. The morale of the garrison crumbled. The battle seemed decided. Operation Vulture and the aftermath. In desperation, Paris and General Navarre called on their last hope, the United States. They proposed Operation Vulture, an urgent plea for U.S. B-24 flying fortresses to carpet-bomb Viet Minh positions. The question was, would the U.S. intervene to save its ally? In Washington, the request sparked a fierce debate. Hawks like Secretary of State Dulles and Vice President Nixon wanted immediate intervention to halt the communist tide. But others, notably General Ridgway, who had learned a painful lesson in Korea, warned against an unwinnable land war in Asia. Ultimately, President Eisenhower hesitated. He conditioned intervention on the participation of an international coalition, especially Britain. Britain refused, and Operation Vulture was canceled. With no hope of rescue, the garrison's fate was sealed. After 56 days and nights of fighting, the fortress fell. The collapse of Dien Bien Phu was more than a mere military defeat. It was an earthquake that shook the foundations of colonialism and redrew the world's political map. The cost of the 56-day siege was horrific. The French suffered heavy casualties, but perhaps the greatest tragedy belonged to the 9,000 men taken prisoner, many of whom would never return. On the Viet Minh side, the great victory also came at a steep price, with thousands of casualties. The legacy. As the guns fell silent at Dien Bien Phu, diplomats sat down at the negotiating table in Geneva. The military defeat forced France to accept the end of its presence in Indochina. The result was the Geneva Accords, which formally ended the war and temporarily partitioned Vietnam at the 17th parallel. In this pivotal moment, as the French flag was lowered, another power stepped in to fill the vacuum. The U.S. began strongly backing the fledgling government of South Vietnam. One war had just ended, but the stage was set for a new, much larger, and much more brutal conflict, the American War in Vietnam. The Geneva Accords were meant to bring peace, but the general election to unify the country never took place. The division of Vietnam became permanent, creating two opposing states. And this leaves us with a profound question. In trying to extinguish the French War, did the world unknowingly sow the seeds for a much greater fire?